religion of ethical monotheism, not merely monotheism. To ask ourselves in moral terms what God and what our commitments to morality ask of us in any single moment in our lives, throughout our lives. One of the lessons that came out this morning was that Moses and Aaron, at the moment when they were standing before Pharaoh, who was a god and a man, clearly the most powerful man in the world at the time, were respectively 87 or 80 and 87 years old. So maybe there's a great lesson, that we're never too old. We're never able to morally and honestly say, I'm no longer a part of this story. We have to step up at any age in our lives. We're the people who gave the world through Torah the obligation to rise against injustice, the imperative not ever to stand idly by, to be passive, to allow ourselves to be merely impotent observers of a world shaped and misshaped by human choice. Elie Wiesel put it so beautifully. He said, whenever men and women are persecuted because of their race, religion, or political views, that place must, at that moment, become the center of the universe. I'll tell you that as thinking about Elie Wiesel as a Jew, and as a rabbi and as a reader of Jewish history, I can speak for hours on the pervasive and pernicious racism that is anti-Semitism, because that's my story. So I've invested many, many, many hours of my life learning and reading and listening. But what shames me in this moment of my life is that I haven't done the same to learn about the racism that occurred and occurs toward other peoples in my world. And I ask myself, in humility and in honesty, how that can be acceptable, how I can be so singularly minded and focused to only focus on and concern myself with my pain and our pain. I think that's missing the message of our religion and of our moral tradition. So we know that revelation happens on its own timeline, its own schedule. It doesn't wait for us. Sometimes lightning strikes and we're awakened. Sometimes revelations of different kinds happen in our lives and we are asleep to them. And the question is, are we ever willing to stop, to put the brakes on our own agendas and to stop our own speech, our own words, and just to listen? So to frame tonight, my intention tonight is to spend the next hour with Kiyomi, with David, with all of you. Not in a conversation, I want to say that clearly, not in a conversation about the realities of race, but instead in a different mode, which is the mode of listening and learning from two people who have a lot to teach me, as they already have, and all of us, I believe, from their experiences and their perspective. So I'll offer some guiding questions, and then along with you, I will be a quiet, active listener, listening with curiosity and with humility. For anyone who doesn't know this couple, don't know Kiyomi Kowalski and David Harris, I want to briefly introduce them to you. Kiyomi and David met where most couples meet, at a Starbucks, nearly 11 years ago. They've been together ever since. They've raised two gorgeous kids, really wonderful and beautiful kids, Moses and Kennedy, who are in our Valley Outreach Synagogue community, have been for the past 8 years. David earned his BA in sociology at Berkeley. He earned his law degree from Yale Law School. During school, David was vice president of the Berkeley ACLU. He was active in Yale's criminal defense and legislative reforms clinics. He's a partner at Hawkshurst Harris, LLP, where he practices complex commercial litigation. Kiyomi is a Marine Corps veteran. She earned her BA in political science at Cal State Northridge. She earned her law degree with public service distinction from Southwestern Law School. Kiyomi volunteers a lot. Many of you know that. She currently serves on the boards of Valley Outreach Synagogue's education program for adults and kids, which is called JULES. And she serves as a volunteer for Law Project of Los Angeles. As a couple, I'll tell you from my own experience, David and Kiyomi are deeply, deeply, passionately committed to raising good kids, to raising anti-racist children who fight for social justice and who give back to their communities. So let's launch in, because I don't want you to sit there for too long getting nervous. Or maybe I should be the one who's getting nervous. David and Kiyomi, I mentioned a little about how you met, but what I haven't asked you that I want to ask you, because I think these personal stories matter, and I think they allow us an entry point into bigger stories. So that what I want to ask you is, as an interracial couple meeting at Starbucks 11 years ago, what role did race play in your conversation with one another, in your conversation with yourselves, in the moments when you interacted with family and friends and said, hey, I want to introduce you to?
We actually met online before meeting in person at Starbucks.
The very same day.
Same day. And if I remember correctly, after a few messages back and forth online, the issue of race did come up briefly, because Kiyomi asked me if I had dated other Black women before. And mostly it was out of fear that I had a fetish or predilection for only dating Black women, which to her is a little bit creepy if you're that narrowly focused on a specific.
As well, but go ahead, Dave.
That's the first time race came up.
I forgot.
Yeah.
I have a very if you say I only date Black women, I'm like, I don't think that's something I want to do. I like people who like everyone and want to associate or willing to be in relationships with whomever. So I figure that to be kind of creepy. So he passed that test, and we met in Starbucks mere hours later, and the rest is history, as they say.
Along that way to history to now.
Yeah, well, yes, a lot happened.
A lot happened. Curly-haired, beautiful kids happened. But what about race played a factor in your early life before you were even knowing whether you were committing lives to each other?
Oh gosh, we both grew up in Palmdale. We happened to both grow up in the same town. At the time, I think it slowly became more diverse over the years. But I always say this so that people really can picture Palmdale really well in their heads. In '97 was when I graduated from high school. But during that period of time, my high school crosstown rival was Johnny Rebel, complete with Confederate flag. Until 96 or 97 was when he was taken down. Finally. So I was raised steeped in white supremacy in a way, right? That town, they had no problems with the mural of Johnny Rebel and the Confederate flag behind him.
So going back to pre-David days, what was your experience as a Black girl growing up in school and a Black woman growing up in school in that environment? Did you face racism? Were you aware of racism? Did you have a consciousness around it?
Well, I often look back on it, and I recall that my ignorance at the time was actually quite blissful. But yes, quite a bit of racism, but I didn't fight it at the time. I was more in a space where I thought to go along to get along. But I remember being young in Simi Valley before we even moved to Palmdale. In Simi Valley, predominantly white communities, certainly in the 80s. I remember talking to my mom and saying, why can't I be white? I just want to be white, and I want to have straight hair, and I want to fit in with everyone. And it was, I look back and I'm absolutely embarrassed and hurt by the fact that I rejected myself in that way. But it was, even though it wasn't specifically told to me, it was felt that I was different and not beautiful because of that difference.
I'm reading a lot, as you and I know. I'm reading and listening and reading and reading. And one of the things that's becoming apparent to me are patterns in people's lives. Now, one of the patterns that I've seen and that I'm asking you about do you find that all Black people have those embarrassing memories of themselves, of saying, if only I would be happier, I would fit in, I would have friends? Does everybody have that passage they go through in their lives where they have this naive wish to be the other, and then they realize at some point that they are the other in a different way that's meaningful?
So I'm going to say no, because I know a lot of people of color, Black women specifically, who were raised to be very proud to be Black and unapologetically Black. And I've learned most of my lessons far too late in life from those women. So I'm going to say not everyone does. You know, as much as I love my mom, she raised me at the time with the idea that we should be colorblind, you know? And at the time, I think that was people doing their best to, you know, curtail the effects of racism. And hopefully if we all don't see color, then we all don't have problems with color. Unfortunately, of course, that is not true. It becomes a problem for people regardless of whether you see it or pretend to not see it or not. So I will say I'm not here to speak for every Black woman. I can only speak from my own experience. And I know many Black women who have had my same experience, but I also know many Black women who have not.
Going back to both of you, David, do you remember any, I don't want to say ill feelings because they weren't necessarily ill at all, but any discomfort about introducing Kiyomi to your parents or family or friends, or even within yourself, any conflict about your interracial relationship? Did it matter in a way that was uncomfortable?
I don't think it mattered too much. I mean, it's something that you're definitely aware of, and you learn which relatives have hidden biases that they're not aware of, even when they're well-intentioned. You know, I remember when one particular relative, one of the first times Kiyomi was over at our house with my family for dinner, we were discussing politics, and I was, you know, complaining that Obama wasn't liberal enough for me, which is my own political view. And this particular relative made a very strong point of looking directly at Kiyomi and saying, I still support Obama.
I vote for him.
Obviously there's no bad intent in saying that, but it evinced a certain uncomfortableness that he had about having a conversation about a Black president that would be critical in front of my Black girlfriend.
And at the time, I wasn't saying anything, so he had no idea what my political affiliation was. So
she happened to agree with me, which she said at the time. But so, you know, I think, you know, I'm lucky to come from a loving, open, caring family. But no matter how open or caring you are, you have blind spots about yourself and about certain biases that you just internalize simply by being alive, whether you want it or not, right? Or concerns or fears.
I remember asking him, it was Passover. I call it the guess who's coming Passover story. I remember asking him, you know, hours before, I said, did you mention that I'm Black to family? And I don't know what answer I was looking for at that time. Thankfully, he said, should I? Like, and I thought, oh, well, you know what? You're probably right. It shouldn't be a thing. And of course, I came to Passover and they discovered who I am and loved me very deeply. All of me.
And little did they know, or you know at the time, that you'd name your child Moses, but we can go on from there. So I want to ask you another question. Do you think, I was listening to somebody speaking today about interreligious dialogue and how far we've come, and he was talking about the fact that he was just invited by the king of Saudi Arabia to be in his presence in Saudi Arabia for interreligious dialogue, and he was talking about what gives him hope and what doesn't. And he said, you know, the pessimist looks down at the glass. Remember, it's always about, is the glass half full or half empty? He says the pessimist looks down through empty space and sees first what's missing and then sees what is. And the optimist looks up from the bottom of the glass and first sees how much is filled and then sees what's missing. So clearly there's truth in both of those perspectives. I'm just thinking about you as a couple having met with the seeming comfort that you have and that your family had about you. Do you think that would have been different a decade or two prior? Do you think that's good progress in American society? That you were able to meet and not have the discomfort that other couples would have had those years ago? Or do you think that's unique to your story?
I think there's definitely progress, but it's there's still awkwardness surrounding it with others. There just is. You know, I worked for a boss who, when he found out who my partner was, came to me specifically for no apparent reason and asked if I would be offended if we didn't get Martin Luther King Day off, which is just a bizarre. I mean, no one else was asked, right? So, you know, people, there's still a certain level of discomfort. You know, I think there's definitely been progress, but with progress comes other challenges. I think one of the challenges that's come with the sort of progress we've had is that people now know what they're not supposed to say, which then makes it somewhat more invisible, right? It makes the biases, the prejudices, and the racism a little bit more difficult to spot, because no one's going to, well, less people are going to go around and yell names at us or yell names at Kiyomi or my kids, but they're still going, because they know that they can't, right? They can still harbor opinions, feelings, even if they may not even be aware of them, that influence their view of us and everyone else.
So talking about the kids now, how does race play into parenting your Black, white, Jewish, American kids? What is it? How is it part of your conversation with them? Is it a big part of the conversation? What kind of consciousness are you raising in them? What kind of questions come up from them? I know I'm asking a lot of questions at the same time, but what's the experience of rearing your kids in the reality of your family today?
One thing that was shocking to me, probably as a white guy, was how quickly race entered my kids' lives. So Moses, when he was born, we had a midwife, a lovely Jewish woman. She was very nice, very helpful, and well-intentioned, I'll say that. But, you know, after he was born, we went back to her. And so he's been around in the world for a handful of days now. He's tiny. And she's looking at him, making sure he has all of his toes and fingers. And, you know, somehow someone said something about the color of his skin being light. I think she did. And Kiyomi pointed out, well, you know, he's darker on the back of his hands, so he may get darker. And the midwife's response was, it's not that bad. And what was interesting was that perspective, that the darkness was a bad attribute. Yeah. And that we were hoping that he would be lighter. Yeah. And we had almost a word-for-word same conversation with someone in the synagogue, in our own synagogue.
Yeah, he was a baby. He was a little guy. Same. Like, I think it was within a couple weeks. It was the same thing, and the woman was thrilled to see him, but said, "Oh, well, it's a good thing he's not that dark."
Yeah, I think you're very lucky.
You're very lucky he's not that dark, meaning not as dark as you, right? Yeah. So, I mean, that was one of the first things. My baby, literally in his little baby carrier, fresh to the world, and that, yeah. So, yeah, you know, I constantly face the microaggressions, as they say, and it's like the death of 1,000 cuts. It's these tiny, tiny little things that people say and do, and they're not so tiny, right? And I mean, it gives you a glimpse into what people are thinking. So no, they're not going to outwardly call me any names or anything like that, but the things that they say and the way that they think, whoa, well, you weren't born Jewish, or you weren't, you know, I'm like, how do you know? I know plenty of Black Jewish people. It's you know, within the community as well. It's just, it's unnerving at times, as progressive as we'd like to think of ourselves.
Yeah, you talk about microaggressions, and you and I have talked about that term. And it's come to have a lot of meaning to me, because now I see things through that lens and ask myself, what would it feel like on a daily basis or at any points in my life to suffer these little blows, right? To my sturdiness, to my sense of self. And what about if I'm a kid? What does it do to me? What does it do to my sense of self if people are constantly cutting at me? Now, some would say, well, it'll make you more resilient. It'll make you stronger because you'll have suffered the slings and arrows at an early age. But I don't think that's the intent. I'd rather we get our bruises and our muscle from something other than being hurt by other people. So tell us more, if you would, about your conversations with your two kids about race.
Well, I've done a really specific and intentional job raising them to be proud of both sides of their heritage. Because I didn't feel that being young, I want to make sure that my kids feel that. So Moses, for instance, very early, we're reading books about Black historical figures. We're reading great stories about people who are just, Black people who just do things in the world, right? I mean, I hate to think of our being a Black person being judged by our oppression all the time and our pain all the time, right? Because we get in a situation like this and we do feel a deep amount of pain, of course. But I want my children to see what we've contributed to society. So much as we, as Black people, have done to make this world. The literal America is built on our backs, right? So I want them to know that. So we talk openly about it. I don't try to shield them from anything at all. I want them to know and be proud of their heritage and who they are, so that, if they're in a room of anyone who would even attempt to disparage them in any way, that they feel that strength.
So are you also having that conversation about their Jewishness? I mean, you and I spoke when there was this huge rise in anti-Semitism. And I remember your sensitivity, and you came to it saying, what is this going to be? And I thought, wow, what is your experience as parents? You're doing what a mother and a father should do, which is wrap your arms around your children to protect them and steady them and sturdy them and build them up. And yet they can be attacked for so many aspects of identity.
Yes, yeah, that was something. We've always made a pact to talk to our kids about anything they're willing to ask. If they're willing to ask it, we're willing to give them the truth. And Moses caught the news when the Torah was ripped out of the in LA.
Synagogue.
There's a synagogue.
Broke in and ripped up the Torah.
Exactly.
And he was so upset by it. He asked to watch the news, and he wanted to talk about it and process that. And certainly, we nurture all aspects of our children, because first of all, it's important that they're excited about who they are and that they have a history and understand that history. But I also want them to be in the world as warriors against hate of all kinds. So yeah, I'm very intentional about all of it.
Yeah. I think what's important to emphasize on what Kiyomi's saying, if you go online, you listen to certain talking heads, and the response to claims of racism in particular, not so much anti-Semitism, maybe I'm wrong and maybe you can educate me on that, but oftentimes the response to racism, claims of racism, is that why are you you're turning yourself into a victim, right? Stop turning yourself into a victim. And I think what's Kiyomi's trying to emphasize and what's important to emphasize is that narrative's wrong. Parents and people who are trying to be anti-racist are not trying to make victims out of anyone. They're trying to empower people to fight against institutions and structural systems that aren't working for them. There's not a day when we go to our kids and say, well, that D on the test is probably because of racism. Let's go blame the teacher and get
that it didn't work.
Right. you know, that's not what it's about. And I think it's important to point out as often as possible, because that is one of the main responses when you try to point out racism is, oh, we have a society of victims, and that's what you want.
Race card.
You're a bunch of weak people who need to paint yourself as victims to get ahead, and that it's actually the opposite. It's about empowering our kids to stand up when they confront these sorts of obstacles, not to try to use them to their benefit somehow, which you can't. I mean, how do you turn anti-Semitism to your benefit? You can't. You can't turn racism to your benefit. So.
All we can ask for is equality, and I think that's all.
One of the things we hear a lot about is, particularly for young Black men, but not only, clearly, is their encounters with law enforcement all around the country. And I want to say, for clarity, that law enforcement differs all around the country. So it's another blanket statement that we're making about systems. And one of the things I heard this week from LAPD was the huge advances that they've made since, and I was in a meeting with the president of the NAACP and a number of different or representatives of Black communities, with meeting with LAPD, and LAPD was asking them, so do you see that we've made huge advances? And they were saying enormous advances. We're not there yet. And he said, the chief of the Valley said, we're clearly not there yet. We know that, but we're intent on getting there. We're making great advances. But when we turn on the news any given day, especially now, because it's such a hot topic, which is good, and we're starting to see the realities of police encounters with Black people. Do you talk to the kids about that, or is that not a necessary conversation at their ages? What to do if you're pulled over for jaywalking, like just happened in, I think, Tulsa? Is that relevant to your conversation with Kennedy yet?
Yes, just recently, actually. Kennedy was playing across the street from the synagogue in a parking lot, like on the corner of Las Virgenes, getting out of school. And he was skateboarding with some friends, and the police came and told him to stop. Easy enough. But then, so I talked to him and I said, wait a second, where were you skateboarding? Oh, well, we were in the front. And then we went to the back. And I'm like, wait, why did you go to the back? Oh, because the police told us to stop skateboarding. I'm like, wait a second. You what? Well, don't worry, Mom. I ran when the police officer came from. I'm like, wait, what? For me, as a Black mother in Calabasas, where my kid is the one dark kid amongst all the kids, I was like, are you out of your mind? While I know it is not on the books that cops can shoot you in the back, right, for running away. Right. They do, and they have, and I don't know what you were thinking. It is so critical that we talk to our kids, Black kids. Most certainly, it's called The Talk, and I don't know if you're reading, you've come across The Talk yet, but there's always The Talk. And I've always said, Kennedy, you can be discreet easily, just by function of being a stupid kid. Don't be that stupid kid. And it scared us quite a bit. It was quite a conversation in our household over a few weeks. It's scary, and I know you mentioned about it not being a system, but I mean it is a system. Like, and regardless of any progress that's being made, it's not enough. We have people being killed at a regular interval, well overrepresented. We have people and that's just to talk about the people who are being killed. Okay, like people, in Black communities, we are over policed and underserved. So I think
the narrow focus on police violence is important right now, and it's also, frankly, what gets the headlines. You know, but the criminal justice system in America is functionally broken when it comes to race. Now, I did, before going into civil litigation, I was a criminal defense attorney for 3.5, 4 years. And, you know, the system is set up in a way that perpetuates sending young Black men to prison. And you can look at any study, it's across the board. Anyone who tells you otherwise just hasn't researched it. Young Black men get sentenced to longer terms than young white men for committing the same crimes. Young Black men get executed for the same crimes when young white men don't. You know, if people haven't, I recommend going down to the criminal court building in downtown LA, because it is shocking, because when you walk in, it is packed to the gills. You will be waiting in line for the elevator for 20, 30 minutes. And every single person in there, except for, you know, the attorneys or staff, is waiting to go before a judge for a criminal case. And it is a sea of Black young men. And that is not, you know, that is not a mistake. You know, the studies also show that white people commit crimes at around the same rate, particularly the crimes that most people get convicted of: drug crimes,
Right.
theft, you know, stealing something from Walmart. It is not an issue of white people being better behaved. It is an issue of where you're putting police resources, and also the issue of how the cops handle it once they catch you, because there, you know, there's a possibility as a white guy who looks nice, if I get stopped, the cop may just give me a warning, or, you know, as long as it's something minor. But that possibility is not there for young Black men in many cases. And at any rate, it's a structural problem from top to bottom to top. You know, politicians are finally admitting it. I mean, you know, for decades now, people have been saying, why do you go to prison for decades for crack cocaine, but not for cocaine,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Same.
And the only reason was because of who was using those drugs. There's no other reason. And politicians are finally starting to admit that and roll back those laws. But you don't.
And marijuana. I go up to the atrium and it's a sea of white women waiting to buy their weed. Okay, but I let them know while we're in the waiting room. I say, hey, do you know Black men are still sitting in prison for what you are about to buy legally? Because they haven't repealed all of that. Like it's a system. It's not a few bad apples. It's not a random happenstance. Like it's a system.
And I don't want to just get stuck on criminal justice, but
Right.
but I think one of the things to realize about it is that, you know, because people don't understand the term structural racism. I don't think people have researched it enough to understand it. I don't fully understand it. And, you know, I went to school for sociology that had a large focus on it for 4 years. But, you know, the way you can start thinking about the system is this: once you recognize that there's a problem in the criminal justice system, where young Black men in particular are more likely to be sentenced to crimes, to be caught and sentenced to crimes than young white men, even though populations are by and large committing the same amount of crime. Then you go to the next. Well, what does that mean? Well, now that means that more young Black men are felons who cannot vote. And then what does that mean? Well, if they can't vote, they can't change the laws about crack cocaine and cocaine. And so it just perpetuates and perpetuates. You know, there's a fight in Florida right now about giving felons, ex-felons, back the right to vote. And it got passed by the population, but now the politicians are fighting and trying to water it down. So these are, you know, that's what people mean when they start talking about structural racism. It's these systems that don't really require someone to be running around being an open racist to have them perpetuate. Because once you just start sending police to a certain neighborhood at a certain rate, it just takes people not even noticing to perpetuate the system over and over. No one has to sit there and say, I don't like Black people, to result in a racist conclusion where you have less Black people being able to vote, to change the laws, to get people not in prison as long. So,
but, you know, that's one of the things that I often like to explain to people. You know, when we talk about racism, I'm like, listen, first of all, we all benefit from the system, unfortunately, white people specifically. But I like to remind people, like, you don't have to burn crosses on people's lawns to be a racist, right? Or you don't have, like I said, actually, I worry about those people the least. Like, they're very out with it. We know who you are, and it's a very small percentage of people. But it's the woman in the park calling the police and weaponizing race, who thinks herself not to be a racist, right? But weaponizes race is just like the KKK had trained her from the ground up. That's what we're dealing with, is this inherent racism that is so deeply embedded in our society.
I want to ask you to go deeper, if you don't mind, because I don't want to take a chance that anybody, myself included, goes away unclear.
We don't want that either.
I know, but I think this is too important a conversation, and the kind of conversation that many people presumably aren't having. So I want to just ask, you see, I know, and you and I know, that we tend to look to the same sources for our facts. So we just keep turning the wheel on the same people giving us the same information. We don't challenge that by hearing other perspectives. So I think I'm making an assumption that you're a voice and a perspective that many people don't get a chance to hear. So I want to ask you a couple things. Kiyomi, you mentioned earlier that Black people are typically over-policed and underserved. Unpack that a little. What do you mean by that?
Oh, yeah. Thank you for coming back to that. Yeah, we put a ton of resources in policing Black communities. But as you understand, and it's more clear now than it has been ever with COVID-19 and things, Black people are the ones delivering your groceries. They're packing your groceries. They're delivering your packages. They're doing all of the things. They're in these essential working jobs, but dying at a alarmingly statistically higher rate than white people with the same disease. And it's because of lack of access to healthcare. And there's just all kinds of reasons behind that, but underlying that is how our society has decided that this population is a population that they're going to ignore. That's largely discardable, if you will. And that's why we say Black Lives Matter. And it's not because your life doesn't matter, it's because your life always matters. And we have to proclaim Black Lives Matter because it hasn't and has not yet ever materialized to be a thing in America.
Yeah. Somebody actually said something that I thought was great the other day. A family member likened it, the Black Lives Matter as a phrase, to somebody whose house is burning. You may have heard this also. Yeah. It was so good.
Tell it for the people in the cheap seats.
Well, you'll tell it better than I will. Go ahead.
So they'll say, hey, my house is burning. But if the fire department shows up and says, well, all houses are important, you're saying my house, no, but my house.
Mine is on fire.
You're gonna, yeah, there's a fire at my house. Oh, well, we'll just close down all these other houses. That's really what you're saying. Or I'm gonna show up to your grandpa's funeral and bring a picture of my grandpa who died and say, but my grandpa died too. Right. All grandpas matter. It's like, what? Like, listen, nobody's saying your grandpa doesn't matter. No one's saying that white lives don't matter. But we are saying that we are in a society that constantly affirms that fact. And we want to affirm the fact that we matter. Yes,
clearly, rightfully. Tell me about this, I'll call it ignition point that we're in right now. A flame's been lit, and I don't mean just fires. I mean in the consciousness of people all over the world. I mean, I'm reading articles all over the world about not only protests in the streets, but people raising consciousness around race and how we're treating one another. What do you think? Where do we go from here? What do you think? What do you prognosticate, and what do you hope for?
Look, what I hope for is that my highest hopes are that this is the spark of a bigger change. I'm seeing more people who are not Black marching in these streets and saying, "Oh, I'm mad at it. I'm mad that your life doesn't matter. I'm finally angry. I finally had a chance to read that article. I mean, finally, we're in this like weird situation where COVID's got everybody at home, and maybe the articles that you chose to ignore for the last, however many decades, and now you have time because you're sitting in, and we have a pandemic every 100 years. Okay, well, welcome. They read the articles and they say, oh, that's crazy. I am actually going to literally put my life at risk and make sure that the people that I always thought that I loved and cared about, I'm going to actually put my life on the line for those people. I've seen people doing, white people doing lines protecting Black people who are protesting. I've been seeing people put their bodies on the line who are not me, because I'm always there. You know, it was so funny the other day, not funny, right? The other day we went out to a march or something that was put together in my neighborhood, predominantly, again, white community. And a white guy put together this march that brought out 300 people in this little area. And we just stood on the side of Valley Circle and we're marching. And my friend says, hey, are you making signs? I'm like, girl, I've been had signs. I got signs, I saved them for the next time. So, yeah. And then you know what I did? I went to the garage and I got my sign and I went to the rally. I am hopeful that I don't have to say that again. Like, I got to dust this sign off, here we go. But I'm seeing progress just in the fact that we're having this conversation, just in the fact that synagogues and community leaders who are not Black are actually affirmatively doing more to thwart racism and attempt to raise communities that are anti-racist.
So let's go there. Let's talk in detail about that, because you and I know, and I've been reading a lot. I'm reading that wonderful book by Ibram Kendi about how to be anti-racist. I'm actually, for truth, I'm not reading it. I'm listening to it.
Yeah.
But one of the things I like, by the way, about listening to it is I like his voice and I like his cadence. I'm really enjoying the music of his telling of his story. So that's just me, probably other people as well. But it's the distinction that's important. The difference between being passively, I'm not racist, which hopefully every single person watching this is saying, and shifting from that to a different kind of consciousness and activating ourselves in a different way, which is anti-racist. Can you guys go into some real detail on that?
Yeah, I think it's really easy to sit in your living room and not be racist and say, oh, I'm not racist, which is a part of the problem in itself, right? It perpetuates it. And you have your racist uncle over, everyone's got a racist uncle, and he's saying all kinds of crazy things at the Thanksgiving or Passover table, and you're just like, oh, that's just my racist uncle. No, being an anti-racist is a person who says, no racist uncle, there are no racist uncles allowed at my table. It's a verb, it's an action, and it requires people to say, affirmatively, I am against this, because the opposite of racism isn't not racist. The opposite of racist is anti-racist.
David.
I agree.
What does it mean? What are you looking for in us? What are you looking for in yourself, in your kids? What will make the world have promise for your children? Make it particular to you. What do you want for them that, in a sense, I know you're raising them to deliver the goods as two good human beings, right? But you're also relying on the society around them to step up and do better and be awakened to what we must do. So what are you looking for? What is this anti-racism? How do you explain it that people will go away with a sense that it matters?
Yeah, I think it's recognizing, for a couple of decades now, the rallying cry was let's all just be colorblind.
Right.
Let's all just say we don't see each other's skin color and go on with life and everything will be better. And that doesn't work. And it doesn't work because of what we said earlier of things, there are structures and societal features that are built around skin color. A good example of that is back in, I think it was the early 2000s, maybe the late 1990s. California and some other states started trying to pass proposals to ban keeping race-based data. So, for example, with police stops, you would no longer record what race was stopped. And, the idea that simply by no longer paying attention to whether you're stopping, 800 times more young black men than young white men, or 800 times more young white men than young black men, so that somehow turning that off and turning off the information and not talking about it would make racism go away is simply a false proposition. And I think it's, proven that it just doesn't work. And I don't think it was ever what that line was intended to mean, that, someday we'll be colorblind. It wasn't meant, oh, well, let's just stop talking about it and everything will be okay. I think what I hope comes out of this is people realize that that's not the solution. So many people use that as that sentence as a defense of against having to take a hard look at society and a hard look at laws and a hard look at who they're voting for and a hard look at who they're associating with and a hard look at themselves. Because as soon as you start talking about racism, they say, look, I want a colorblind world. Oh, you're the one being racist by bringing race into the subject, right? And so, what I hope is, because things aren't going to change overnight. These problems arose over hundreds and hundreds of years in this country, and it's not going to, they're not going to pass a law tomorrow that makes it all go away. But what I hope is that people start to put down the defense of I want a colorblind world and I'm not racist, and stop reacting when they hear conversations about racism self-defensively with those sorts of slogans, and start actually trying to wrestle with the problem.
Yeah, one of my dearest friends, it took me a long time to break through. I hope I've now at this point broken through, but she was insistent, I don't see color, and I'm going to raise my kids not to see color. And I'm like, let me tell you something, that society dictates what you see, whether you admit it or not. Actually, unfortunately, it doesn't matter. And if you raise these children without the skill set to understand what society is putting into their heads, which is that Black men are equated to violence, and that to be afraid of that Black man with a hoodie, or be afraid of all these things. And it comes in regardless of whether you want it to or not, completely unbidden. But if you do not establish those tools within your children and within yourself to discard that information as false, based on knowledge that the society is doing that to you, and that there is a system in place for you to think that way, then they're just going to be the next person colorblind.
The word system may make some people think, oh, you're saying you're victims of something that's so structural and so big that it can never be changed. Or that maybe you say, well, if this mountain is as it is, it's unchangeable, I can't do anything about it. Can you guys go, before we finish, I want to really make sure that people understand because we're all hearing these terms about institutional racism, structural racism, systemic racism. What's the takeaway that you want people to get? David Harris.
I mean, sure, it's hard to change the system. I mean, I don't know. There's no nice way to say it. It's not something that you change overnight. I think what people need to remember, though, is that this is not a fight that's been going on for all that long, right? My parents and grandparents were alive when there was, active laws segregating white people and Black people. I think there were probably laws around when my mother was alive that would have prevented me from marrying Kiyomi.
Misogyny laws were just outlawed in the late 60s, 70s.
So the idea that this is the idea that this is some intractable problem that can't be solved, I think, is false, because I think this is a new problem. But I think the corollary to that is that the people out there saying, this problem we dealt with long ago, and why are you still blaming me for something that I had nothing to do with? That's just a false narrative. Yeah. I mean, this is not ancient history. This
redlining kept Black people out of certain neighborhoods for the longest time. There are still, if you go and pull records in the books, there are CCNRs that say specifically no Jews in the neighborhood, or specifically no blacks. They're still on the books. I mean, they can't be enforced,
Right.
but it wasn't long ago. I constantly combat with people is that they'll say, that was so long ago, get over it. I'm like, no, man, it wasn't. And, you know, and there are the lasting effects of it through wealth passage and the lack thereof. It doesn't matter how educated Black people get in this society, they are still earning far less. They're basically our net worth as a community is zero.
Oh, that's bad news.
Yeah.
But the good news is, no, the good news is that because it's a recent fight. You know, I don't think people should sit there saying this is impossible to change. That this is just how the world is. You know, as you said earlier, change has come. Progress has been made. There's still a long way to go. And I think people too easily get distracted and say, well, we met this goalpost, therefore done, and I can wipe my hands of it. But I don't think people should sit and feel like there's no hope. I think that there's definitely hope. I think like I said, it's a recent fight. It's not old news, and we just need to keep moving forward.
I'm in. I really appreciate this conversation. I was thinking about a couple of thoughts, rabbinic thoughts, as you'd imagine might happen. And one of them was about authenticity and about living who you are, your whole self. And I remember going to a conference where a Black woman, a leader in business, was saying, I was always told, get rid of your edges, essentially. Go into the world without your edges, those things that make you unique and maybe make other people uncomfortable. She said, no, I got to where I am. And she was a titan in industry by holding on to who I am, all of who I am, authentically being me as a Black woman with my story, not only of race. And there's a rabbinic story about Reb Zusia, who is with his students before the end of his life. And they say to their master teacher, they say, Reb Zusia, what do you imagine God will ask you when you die? And he says, God won't ask me. My fear is God won't ask me, Zusia, why weren't you more like Moses? Zusia, why weren't you more like Abraham or Isaac or Jacob? My fear is that God will ask me, Zusia, why were you not more like Zusia? Yeah. And I read something today that I thought was a parallel story. It's by the South African writer and anti-apartheid activist, Alan Paton. He once wrote, when I go to heaven, the big judge will look at me and ask, where are your wounds? And I'll say, I have none. And he'll say in turn, was there nothing to fight for? So I really want to just express my appreciation to both of you. You know, it goes beyond this conversation, but I'm so grateful for who you are and the fact that I have you in my life, not just in my community and in my kids' lives. In a moment, we're going to hear from Carla Devi, our Director of Lifelong Learning, and this is a part of lifelong learning. If not, then we've missed the message of learning and education. If we think that we know enough, then we clearly need some kind of revisit to wisdom and education. So before inviting Carla to speak in a moment, I just want to thank the two of you. And I want to thank about 100 some people who have been on Zoom, now it's down to 94. And everybody who's on Facebook Live. What I imagine will happen through Facebook Live is these numbers will grow in the coming days because this will still be up. And I hope it provokes great conversation and great thought and great learning. You're going to get a message. And the message tomorrow, I believe, Kiyomi, is going to give you more to listen to and more to read. And I hope that you'll take the opportunity to enrich your mind and enrich our world and our community by what you learn and what it activates in your life. David, Kiyomi, thank you so much. And Matt, would you bring Carla into the room if you would?
With pleasure. One sec.
Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you for participating in the Realities of Race interview this evening. As the Director of Lifelong Learning at Valley Outreach Synagogue, I know of one vital response to curbing systemic racism in American society. In the words of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, education is the single greatest key to human dignity. There is no denying that we certainly have a lot of learning to do on this topic. Tonight's event launches an ongoing social justice and anti-racism education campaign at Valley Outreach Synagogue for all ages. Next up is watching the film 13th, which won numerous critic awards and was nominated for an Academy Award. After the film will be questions and discussion led by experts in American history. In the months to come, we will continue conversations with experts and those in the Jewish community who have experienced racism, as well as participatory workshops led by experts in anti-racism. For our youth, Rabbi LiPaz will lead a discussion in the coming weeks, and we will continue that discussion through the Jules curriculum with themes such as B'Tselem Elohim, all humans created in the image of God, which will be led by our educators who are doing their own learning and special training. Please watch for details of these events in the weeks and months to come. We hope that you have found value in tonight's discussion. There is no cost to you because we believe that these important messages should be available to all. But please consider a high or $18 donation or more to fund this education. Be sure to note that it should be directed to anti-racism education. Thank you for joining us. Good night and Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you, Carla. She mentioned Shabbat Shalom. I want to say that tomorrow evening at 7, vosla.org, you can join us for what will be a beautiful Shabbat in nature. David, Kiyomi, thank you so much. Matt Witkin, thank you so much. To our chaplain, Jennifer Nye, to our education board and team who are so invested in this conversation and making sure that it doesn't end at a conversation. This is what we hope will be an inspiring beginning. Thank you to all of you. Have a good evening.
Thank you all for coming. If you guys have any remaining questions, you guys are free to answer, or you guys are free to ask them. Yeah, so thank you guys very much for attending, and we hope to hear from you soon.